She never thought it would end like this. One moment, she was planning a future with him, believing in every promise he made, and the next, she was staring at a reality she never saw coming. The texts became shorter, the calls less frequent, and the excuses more obvious. She wanted to believe it was just a rough patch, that he was busy, stressed, or maybe just needed space. But deep down, she knew. She had felt it before she even heard the words. The night it all ended, she barely recognized him. The way he looked at her, distant, indifferent, as if she was just another chapter he had already finished reading, was something she would never forget. He didn't try to soften the blow, didn't pretend to be hurting too. He just said it was over, like it was the simplest thing in the world. And just like that, the future she had envisioned shattered at her feet. For weeks, she moved through her days like a ghost, replaying every moment in her head, wondering what she had done wrong. Had she been too much? Not enough? Had he ever really loved her, or had she just been convenient until something or someone better came along? The questions haunted her, keeping her awake at night, making her second-guess everything about herself. She avoided places they used to go, deleted their pictures from her phone, and tried to convince herself that she was fine. But the world had a cruel way of reminding her of him. A song playing in a cafe, a scent that lingered in the air, the sound of laughter that felt too familiar. Everywhere she turned, there were ghosts of the life she thought they were building together. Then came the news that made her stomach drop. He had moved on quickly. While she was still piecing herself together, he was already living as if she had never been a part of his world. People whispered about it, some offering sympathy, others telling her it was for the best. But no words could dull the sting of knowing she had been replaced before she even had time to heal one night, as she sat alone in her apartment staring at the walls that suddenly felt too small. She made a decision. She had spent enough time grieving over someone who hadn't even hesitated to walk away. She was done waiting for closure, done wondering what went wrong. If he could move on without looking back, so could she. She pulled out a notebook and started writing down everything she had ever wanted to do, but had put on hold for him. The places she wanted to see, the dreams she had pushed aside, the risks she had been too afraid to take. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than sadness. She felt a spark. The next morning, she packed a bag, booked a ticket, and walked away from the life that had once revolved around him. She didn't have a plan, didn't know exactly where she was headed, but that was the point. She was no longer waiting for someone else to give her a reason to live. She was going to create her own happiness, on her own terms. As the plane took off, she looked out at the clouds below, feeling a strange mix of fear and excitement. This was her moment, her chance to rewrite her story. He had broken her heart, but he hadn't broken her. And as she closed her eyes, she made a silent promise to herself she would become someone she was proud of, someone who didn't need validation from anyone. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. What came next would change everything. I'll continue the story from where it left off, keeping the tension high and adding more depth to the characters and conflicts. Here's the next part. The days passed, but the ache in her heart refused to fade. Every memory of him felt like a ghost haunting the edges of her happiness. She wasn't broken anymore, but she wasn't the same either. There was a fire inside her now, a quiet determination to live for herself. She had spent too long waiting for someone to choose her, to fight for her, to love her the way she deserved. Now, she was learning to choose herself. Opportunities that once seemed out of reach were now within her grasp. She had always doubted herself, but now, fueled by the pain of betrayal, she pushed forward. Late nights were spent working on projects she once abandoned, and early mornings were filled with quiet reflections and plans for the future. Every step forward felt like reclaiming a part of herself that she had lost in that relationship. But life had a strange way of testing resilience. Just when she thought she had moved on, a familiar name popped up in conversation. a reminder that the past was never too far behind. He was back in town. The news didn't shake her as much as she expected, but it was enough to stir something inside her, a mix of curiosity and old wounds she thought had healed. She didn't want to see him, but the universe had other plans. Their paths crossed at an event she had been invited to, a celebration of success for young entrepreneurs. She had worked hard for this moment, and she wasn't about to let an old heartbreak steal her shine. Yet, there he was, standing across the room, looking at her as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes searched hers, maybe for regret, maybe for a second chance, but she gave him nothing. He had been the one to let her go, and she had learned to live without him. The past no longer held her captive. What he thought, what he felt, it didn't matter anymore. She turned away, head held high, as the night carried on without him. She was living her dream now, and for the first time, she truly believed she didn't need him to complete it. This section keeps the suspense building while showing her growth. Let me know if you want more. She left the event feeling lighter than she had in years. Seeing him again didn't bring back the pain, it only confirmed what she had always suspected. She had outgrown him. The version of her that once cried over his broken promises was gone. She had stepped into a new chapter, one where she was the main character, not just someone waiting on the sidelines for love to validate her existence. But life wasn't done testing her just yet. Over the next few weeks, his presence became unavoidable. Mutual friends mentioned him in passing. His name appeared on event lists, and social media occasionally reminded her of the life they once shared. She ignored it all, refusing to let the past creep into the present. Then one evening, as she sat in her favorite cafe, lost in thought, a voice pulled her back to reality. "Mind if I sit here?" She didn't have to look up to know it was him. There was a time when that voice could make her heart race, but now it barely stirred anything. She glanced up, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. "This seat is taken," she said simply. Returning her focus to her laptop, he hesitated, as if expecting a different reaction. "Can we talk?" she sighed. "About what about us?" he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I know I messed up. I see you now, and there is no uses to talk about," she interrupted, her tone calm but firm. That chapter is closed. His face fell, but she didn't feel guilty. Not anymore. He had his chance, and he let it slip through his fingers. That moment solidified what she already knew: she had moved on. Not just from him, but from the version of herself who thought she wasn't enough. She stood up, grabbed her coffee, and walked away without looking back. And for the first time in a long time, she felt completely free as she walked away from him that evening. She expected closure to feel like a final door shutting, a clean break from the past. But instead, it felt like a shift, a quiet realization that life wasn't waiting for her to move on. It had already done so. Yet despite her confidence in leaving him behind, something lingered in the air, a tension she couldn't quite shake. Over the next few days, she found herself running into him more often than seemed coincidental. At first, it was subtle, a familiar figure in the corner of the bookstore, a glance from across the street. But then, it became more direct. One evening, as she exited her office building, she saw him standing near the entrance, as if he had been waiting for her. She sighed, adjusting the strap of her bag, knowing this wasn't going to stop unless she addressed it head-on. "Are you following me now?" she asked, her voice even but firm. "No," he said quickly. "I was just—" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck before exhaling. "Okay, maybe a little," she raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's not flattering. You know, I just wanted to talk." "Properly," he admitted, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "Not just for a minute at a cafe or in passing. I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to say this." She glanced at her watch. Every part of her told her to walk away, to shut the door on whatever he was trying to reopen. But there was something in his expression that made her pause. Not because she still cared, but because she wanted to understand 5 minutes. She said they walked to a quiet park nearby, sitting on opposite ends of a bench. He took a deep breath, staring at his hands before speaking. "I was selfish," he admitted. "I took you for granted, and I didn't see what I had until it was too late." He glanced at her, as if searching for any sign of emotion, but her expression remained unreadable. "You're different now. You look happier, stronger, and I hate that I wasn't the one to make you feel that way." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You were never supposed to be the one to make me feel that way. I had to learn to do that for myself." He swallowed, as if those words stung more than he expected. "I know. But does that mean there's no chance there isn't?" she interrupted, her tone firm but not cruel. "Not because I'm angry, not because I want to punish you, but because I've outgrown what we had." Silence stretched between them, heavy yet final. Finally, he nodded, exhaling as if releasing something he had been holding onto for too long. "I get it," he said. "I don't like it, but I get it." She stood up, brushing off the creases in her coat. "Good," she said simply. "Now it's time for you to move on, too." As she walked away, she knew this was truly the last time. No lingering what-ifs, no unresolved tension, just the quiet certainty that she had stepped fully into the life she was meant to live, one where she was no longer waiting for anyone to realize her worth. Days passed, and she thought that conversation would be the last of it. She had moved on, found peace in her new life, and embraced the changes that once felt impossible. But something was off. She started noticing things that didn't add up, messages from unknown numbers that disappeared before she could respond. The feeling of being watched when she walked home at night, and familiar faces appearing in unexpected places. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia. Maybe she was overthinking things, still adjusting to the idea that she had fully left the past behind. But then one evening, as she locked up her shop, she noticed a figure across the street. It was him. He wasn't approaching, just standing there, watching. The moment their eyes met, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Her heart pounded. She wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that he had happened to be passing by, but her gut told her otherwise. The next day, she changed her routine, taking different routes, avoiding places she used to frequent. Yet the feeling of unease only grew then. The messages became more direct. "You think you've won, don't you?" She stared at the screen, the words sending a chill through her. This wasn't just regret or desperation. This was something else. Something darker. She didn't reply, didn't even acknowledge it, but deep down, she knew this wasn't over. One night, as she left work, she heard footsteps behind her. Not the casual, random steps of strangers walking in different directions, but a steady, deliberate rhythm matching hers. She quickened her pace, turning a corner, hoping to lose whoever it was. But as she glanced back, she saw a shadow moving in the dim light. Her pulse raced. She reached for her phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before she could, a voice cut through the silence. "You don't look happy to see me." She turned sharply. There he was, standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just wanted to talk," he said, his tone eerily calm. "But you keep avoiding me because there's nothing to talk about." She took a step back, but he mirrored her movement, closing the distance. "You were everything to me," he continued, his voice low. "And now you act like I never existed." Her fingers tightened around her phone. "That's because you don't exist in my life anymore. You need to move on." He let out a bitter laugh. "Move on? While you're out here living your perfect life, pretending like I never mattered." She swallowed hard. "You didn't matter," she said, forcing the words out. "Not the way you think." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, anger, maybe both. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something colder. "You'll regret saying that," he murmured. She didn't wait to find out what he meant. Turning on her heel, she walked away as fast as she could, forcing herself not to run, not to let him see her fear. But she knew this wasn't the end. Something told her that whatever was coming next would change everything. The uneasy feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger in the days that followed. She couldn't shake the memory of his words, the way he had looked at her, like he was already planning his next move. She changed her routine again, took different routes home, stayed in well-lit areas, but no matter what she did, it felt like he was always just out of sight. Then, things started going wrong. First, it was small things: a package she never ordered arriving at her door, her car alarm going off in the middle of the night with no sign of forced entry. Then it escalated. One morning, as she unlocked her shop, she found the door slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside. Nothing was stolen, but everything was just slightly out of place. The papers on her desk were shuffled, a chair was moved, and the back door, which she was sure she had locked, was open just a crack. She told herself it could have been anyone, a mistake, maybe, but deep down, she knew better. She started keeping the lights on at night, double-checking every lock, but the feeling of being watched never left. Then came the second twist, the one that sent a chill through her entire body. It was late when she received the call. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something told her she needed to. The moment she picked up, there was silence on the other end. She felt her breath hitch. "Hello," she said cautiously. "Nothing. Just breathing." She was about to hang up when a voice whispered, "You don't even see it coming." The line went dead. She stood frozen, her grip tightening around the phone. This wasn't just desperation anymore. This was a warning. The next morning, she went to the police, but without proof, there wasn't much they could do. "Maybe it's just someone trying to scare you," they said. "But we'll keep a report on file." That wasn't enough. She needed to know what he was planning. So she made a decision. One she wasn't sure she'd regret. She needed to see him one last time before it was too late. She knew confronting him was a risk, but she also knew she couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for something to happen. She needed answers. She needed to put an end to it. That night, she left her apartment with a purpose. The streets were quiet, the air thick with the kind of stillness that made her chest feel tight. She had done her research. He wasn't hiding. He was exactly where she expected him to be. The old cafe on the corner, the place they used to go when things were different. When she thought she knew him, she stepped inside, scanning the room, and there he was, sitting alone at a table by the window, his fingers drumming against the cup in front of him. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward him, her pulse racing, but her steps steady. He looked up as she sat down across from him, a slow smile creeping onto his face. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. She clenched her fists under the table. "You need to stop." He leaned back, tilting his head slightly. "Stop what?" "You know what," she said, her voice firm. "The calls, the break-ins, the watching." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You always assume the worst of me." She wasn't going to let him twist the conversation. "I'm not playing this game with you. I need you to tell me why. Why are you doing this?" For a moment, he just looked at her, the amusement in his eyes fading. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because you walked away," he said simply. "You thought you could leave, start over, and I'd just let you." Her stomach twisted, but she refused to look away. "I don't belong to you," she said, her voice steady. "You don't get to control me anymore." Something in his expression shifted. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You think this is about control?" he murmured. "You have no idea." Then, before she could react, he pulled something from his pocket and slid it across the table. A key. Her breath caught. "What is this?" He just smirked. "Go home. Find out." She wanted to throw the key back at him, demand answers, but she knew he wouldn't give them. Not here. Not now. So she stood, grabbing the key without another word, and walked away, feeling his eyes on her the entire time. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were shaking. She didn't want to use the key. She didn't want to know what he had done. But she had no choice. She took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. And then she saw it. Everything looked the same, except for one thing. On the table, in the center of the room, was a single envelope. Her name was written on the front in his handwriting. With trembling fingers, she picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, and when she saw what was in the picture, her heart nearly stopped. It was her, sleeping, taken the night before. She dropped the photo, stumbling back, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. He had been here, while she slept, inches away. A soft creak from the hallway made her blood run cold. She wasn't alone. She froze. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the silence of her apartment, it was deafening. Her mind raced. Had she locked the door behind her? Was there another way in that she hadn't checked? Her breath came shallow, her heartbeat a wild rhythm in her ears. She turned slowly, scanning the dimly lit room, her hands clenched at her sides. Then, another creak. Closer this time. She wasn't alone. She had two choices: stand there and wait for whatever was coming, or move before it was too late. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. If he was here, if he had been waiting for her, then she needed to be smart. She needed to be faster than him. She took a slow step backward, reaching into her pocket, fingers trembling as she wrapped around the small can of pepper spray she had started carrying. Another step. The hallway was only a few feet away. If she could make it to the door. A shadow shifted in the corner of her eye. She spun, raising the pepper spray, but a hand caught her wrist before she could react. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she struggled. But then a familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Wait. It's me." She stilled, her body still tense to fight. The figure loosened his grip, stepping into the dim light, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't him. It was someone she never expected to see here. He looked at her, concern and urgency written all over his face. "Are you okay?" She swallowed hard, nodding, though the pounding in her chest hadn't settled. "What are you doing here?" "I came to warn you," he said, glancing toward the envelope still on the table. His expression darkened. "But it looks like I'm too late." Her stomach churned. "He was here," she whispered, "while I was sleeping." The words felt unreal, like she was speaking about someone else's life, someone else's nightmare. But it was real. Too real. His jaw tightened. "You can't stay here." She nodded. She had already known that the moment she saw the photo. But leaving didn't solve the problem. He would always find her. He had proven that already. "What does he want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated. "It's not just about you walking away," he said. "It never was. He's not just watching you, he's playing a game. And he's not going to stop until he wins." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Then we have to end it first." She had spent too long being afraid, too long letting him control her life from the shadows. If he thought he could keep pushing her, if he thought she would break, he was wrong. Her visitor nodded, his expression grim. "Then we need a plan." And this time, she wasn't going to run. She was going to fight. The night stretched long, as they talked in hushed tones, mapping out their next steps. They knew he was expecting fear. He was expecting her to break. But what he wouldn't expect was for her to take control. By the time dawn broke, she was ready. And this time, she wasn't going to let him win.